Well, thanks for the introduction. Yeah, as you already said, like the title is "Staying with the Trouble of Networks." I think my presentation will make clear why we choose for this title and also why this combination of a Harawayan book title and the word networks. Maybe let me first clarify something about this group of people, this bunch of people I'm working with, because we are from different institutions and the examples and material that I will show you is also from different contexts. So I was a researcher in Utrecht at Utrecht University at the Datafied Society Research Platform. The other group of people is from the Public Data Lab and the University of Geenen, where I'm a PhD at since this autumn. It belongs also to the Public Data Lab. So this is how all of this relates to each other. And this is a work in progress presentation of our troubles with networks, and especially our troubles with network practices, of which I will. Why networks? So start with the notion of networks. There's a prominence of networks and network practices, for example, in the digital realm. As you can see, this is the interface of network mapping tool Gephi, which is also especially specialized on visual network analysis. And as you can see, like the official paper that introduced this software and that belongs to the software is cited almost 5,000 times on Google Scholar. So this kind of illustrates the prominence of networks in the academic world, but also beyond. Let me start with the theoretical underpinnings, which makes the notion of trouble more clear. So, trouble is derived from Haraway's book, Staying with the Trouble, which is more concerned with natural sciences and also the Anthropocene, but we found it quite stunning and quite useful for our research as well. Because she states that trouble can also be read as a verb, and it means stir up and to disturb. And we do think that these network practices that we concern ourselves with are so complicated sometimes that we should reflect on them in the open and that we should make them questionable. So that is what I mean with trouble in that sense. So staying with the trouble then means a form of active awareness through, on the one hand, which Haraway calls responsibility, so the capability to respond. The capability to respond, for example, to the ways networks are presented and networks were interpreted by an interaction between the researcher and the tool. And on the other hand, accountability, and this is the ethnomethodological reading of the word accountability, which means that you're at the same time able to account for a situation because you can document it, and on the other hand, you're able to understand it. So this double meaning of accountability. Let me start to exemplify network troubles based on some examples from the context that I was sketching in the beginning. First, from the research process. So accounting for network practices, what does that mean? One of my cases that I researched in my master thesis was the ready-made Les Miserables, which is a network data sample that is pre-packaged with a Gephi software that comes with a pop-up window, so users can choose to use it because it's a really small sample of only 77 nodes, so that means that it's really easy to engage with this network for a starting user of Gephi and this kind of network tools. But the downside is that this network does not contain a lot of context information. As I will show you on the next slide. So it's not really easy to situate this data set and to make sense of it. Also because it's a fictional network, fictional social network, and what is missing is, for example, information about the chapters in which the co-appearances between characters from the novel Les Miserables happen. So there's no temporality information, there's also no speciality information related to the novel, which makes it difficult to situate this data set and to use it for analysis. Funny thing is, it was originally prepared by Donald Knuth, which is also information that you need to situate it in a technical sense. And And he prepared it for literate programming, which means that he prepared it as exercise material for people who want to engage with technical work. And on the other hand, the irony and chances in this is that literate programming, so the combination of computer language, programming, and natural language to tell a story, is something that is used to account for research practice, for example, in data journalism. So the question is, can we think of the design of tools in terms of, in epistemological terms? So what does the design of tools need to help us to make sense of the data and the tool? Let me show you this example. You have, like, this is the limitable file in the overview tab, and this is the file structure in which you see information about the position, for example, of the nodes, but not why nodes are positioned in that way. So you don't get some information on the used layout algorithm, for example. I will come back to the used layout algorithm. This is Force Atlas 2, specifically designed for Gephi, and I will mention that later on as well. So to sum up, the question is, how can we make sense of not just the data, but also the tool? Because it matters what methods we use to think of methods with, in terms, using Haraway's words. So let me give you another example from the research, as a research product. So what happens when we try to communicate research results? What are the troubles in communicating research results? And how can we make those network practices public in a way that users can really engage with what we did? I have an example from studying the Dutch Twitter sphere, in which we also used the same layout algorithms, Force Atlas 2, to for distant reading of a data sample from 2016, actually 10 days of reply behavior of Twitter users, Dutch-speaking Twitter users, and we wanted to have a look in the everyday communication infrastructure and the publics that we can identify in this communication structure. Our dilemma was, how can we account for the situatedness of these network practices when the audience is actually only faced with a still of the research process? And with a still, I mean this picture that we used, for example, in conference presentations. Static imagery that does only presents our results that we came up with based on the distant reading with the tool and close reading qualitative analysis based on our field knowledge of the Dutch Twitter sphere. So we annotated that graph based on our qualitative knowledge of the Twitter sphere as well. This is even more like this, and then we came up with this publication policy. So we always include all this information of the making process of settings in Gephi. And also, this is basically even more important when you see that this kind of research is also featured in journalistic research and journalistic presentations. For example, there was a follow-up 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, I don't know, it was on the end of August, follow-up on this research where one of our researchers at Utrecht University worked together with the Groene Amsterdammer, which is a weekly magazine in the Netherlands, and they once again delved into the publics active on Twitter and found, of course, like the same publics that we found, the journalists, the media, but also, once again, the YouTube publics, and an even bigger right-wing political sphere. That was what they actually were interested in. The interesting thing about this article is that they had actually space to account for the practices. So there was a whole article published, a whole account published, in which they explained which steps they make to analyze the data and also to make sense of the data with Gephi, amongst other tools. So there's the last theoretical underpinning that I want to present to you based on the traveling of network practices beyond academia. The notion of situated network practices. Since we experienced that these networks indeed travel also in different kind of investigative contexts, and we experienced that it's important, and that is also what the notion of situated network practices emphasizes, that the contexts are reflected upon in which the graph materializes and in which the graph is made public. And with made public, I also mean like that it's not only comprehensible, but also questionable, interrogable. Thank you. And that it's important to study actual interactions between users, researchers, data, methods, and tools. I have some examples of situated networks practices beyond academia. It could be that I will shorten them a little bit, like in relation to the time. I was a little bit too enthusiastic about the 2 examples that I gave, but those examples are really illustrative of my point that I want to make today. So, networks are also used as discovery devices in journalism. What we see is that they are used, for example, for investigative reporting. And that does not only mean that they are used to visualize data and to present them also visually as a graphical representation, but they are also used as just the research practice to make sense of the data. For example, in the Panama Papers, they used network analysis and network visualization to delve into possible stories and possible relation between actors in these stories. That is what you see here, like it's was done with Neo4j, and they established relations between the documents that they were researching. Then there is a variety with troubles of these networks in journalism. And that is also related to the Panama Papers example, that there's always a struggle that journalists kind of experience those network practices as general useless. And that's related to the danger of showing the obvious, or on the other hand, that it's really a complex method to use, and it's not really easy to explain those connections. Like in our network also, there were different kind of media practices, the Twitter network, and it's for a user, for a reader especially, it's really difficult to make sense of those media practices. Also to explain why some nodes are central and other nodes are at the edges of the network, and what does that mean for, indeed, the ways in which users interact with each other. Then there are some data issues that is related, for example, to data that we have to pay for and that are expensive. Then a lack of data, because some data belong to commercial parties, are not available. And then also the question of representativeness. What does digital data reflect? So these are some issues that are central in journalism. And like, you have to have a lot of knowledge, field knowledge and technical knowledge to know which data are relevant for your production. And it's a lot of work. Like, there's a workload, and sometimes you have to do that in your spare time. And then, at last, the tool and graph issues that we as academics experience, but journalists maybe even more. Also, there are costs, like there are a lot of tools that you have to pay for, like Neo4j, for example. Then you need technical knowledge. And the third one is really about the accounting for your practices. Like, you have to really also know how to describe what you did with the data, with the tool, which decisions you made, and to make that understandable for the normal public. Okay, I will skip this one. And this one as well. How can we tackle these problems in academia and beyond academia, in journalism, for example? Well, there are some design initiatives going on, for example, with a public data lab. One of the tools they're coming up with at the moment is the MiniWAN project, the visual network. The VAN stands for Visual Analyzer of Networks. Mini, because it's a web version of, for example, tools like Gephi that help not only to present your data in an interactive way to the public, but also gives opportunities to describe your network. But not only describe, it gives the reader of the network, or more like the one who engages with the network online, also the opportunity to filter the network. So to see which kind of choices you made in the research process and to focus on certain aspects of the network. Like you can really delve into these communities and the description that one gave of the communities. Yeah, and also like, even on node level, I'm sorry, I will be done in a second. So these are opportunities to really give readers like the chance to, or the general public, the chance to really engage with the network. And all the practice, like the whole network practice, the work that the researcher did together with the tool. This is in beta version. It will be launched somewhere this year. Or the field notes plugin, last example that we developed at the Datafied Society platform. It is a documentation plugin for Gephi that you can download at GitHub, and it helps you to document all the settings that you applied to the research that you did in Gephi, like to the network data in Gephi. Okay, my conclusions. Yeah, very shortly. So, staying with the trouble of networks, that means that I hope that I have demonstrated, on the one hand, critical reflection, and on the other hand, practical experimentation. And also like an oscillation between those two. Studying the network practices is an important term to really create awareness for different kinds of network practices. So not only the academic ones, but also journalistic or practices in activism, where research is done as well. Then staying with the trouble of networks means making and using network data, making sense of network graphs, making network graphs public in an engaging way, making tools that offer interactional, analytical, and reflective affordances. And that will be done in the work that we plan for the Public Data Lab, but also in my PhD. Thanks a lot for your attention.